Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of Hormonally Speaking. I am here today with Christina Sanders. And the reason that I brought her on, I was really interested as I've been deep diving recently into genes, their mutations, and how that can impact hormones. And I just can't seem to figure all the things out on my own. So I went looking for an expert, and I have one here for you today. Again, her name is Christina Sanders, and she is a board certified nurse practitioner and a nutritional therapy practitioner with 23 years of clinical experience. She received her first bachelor's degree from the University of Notre Dame and attained her second bachelor's degree and her master's degree from the Johns Hopkins University School of Nursing. In addition to her clinical cardiology practice, Ms. Sanders is the owner of Nutrition NP, where she focuses on optimizing health and wellness through lifestyle genetics. Her approach couples nutrigenetic testing and nutrigenomics expertise to guide your daily choices and create the biggest returns on your health. Christina offers personalized nutrition and lifestyle recommendations, as well as targeted supplement suggestions. Her primary goal in working with clients is improving their states of health by educating and empowering them to use their genetic results to make impactful daily choices. Welcome, Christina.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Oh my God, that's a very powerful bio that you have there. There's a lot
Thank
of
you.
training in there.
It was
Yeah.
worth it.
Well, and I love that and one of the reasons that I was excited to bring you on is you have all of this clinical experience in, allopathic medicine, and then you bring in the, functional side of things too, and really like bridge those in such a good way, and I think that's so important as we move forward in health and wellness, right? In our society.
I agree.
Yeah. So let's start with some of the basics about genes, because, obviously everybody knows that we have genes that kind of, sort of guide what our health is going to be like in life. But I think a lot of times people don't understand the specifics of that, or, how much you can impact your genes too. So can you tell us about that?
Sure. That's a great way to start. So most people are familiar with that image of the double-stranded DNA helix. If you're not, it looks a bit like a ladder that spirals on itself. And so you have two sides of the ladder that are connected by the rungs.
Mm-hmm.
And the rungs are these nitrogen bases, which we call nucleotides, and they're given special letters, A, G, C, and T, so that we can identify them.
Okay.
And your entire DNA sequence is made up of all these letters strung together. And so you can read them from left to right like a book. And that sequence is about 3 billion letters long.
Wow.
3 billion letters.
Yeah.
So within that sequence, you have about 20,000 genes.
Okay.
And the genes are actually small chunks of letters. So that might be 500 letters, it might be 2 million letters.
Okay.
That make up a gene. And a gene is an instruction for building a protein, like a hormone, like dopamine, like insulin. So the genes are instructions for building those hormones and also the enzymes that create certain reactions.
Gotcha.
So our cells have all of our DNA in them. The entire DNA sequence is in every single one of
every
your cells.
cell. Okay, that's what I was going to ask. Wow.
Every cell has every sequence of full DNA. But depending on where those cells are in the body, there are parts of the genes that are kind of turned off and parts of the genes that get turned on to exhibit the functions in those different systems. But every cell still has all of your DNA. So every time that your cell copies itself or divides, an entire copy of that DNA gets transferred to the next cell. Does that make sense?
Yes, totally.
So when you add up all your genes, these 20,000 or so genes that you have, you get the human genome. Okay. So that's all your genes together are what we call the genome. Okay. And they are basically the instructions for building a person. If it's the genome for a dog, it's the instructions for building the dog. But so it's the entire set of genes together builds that particular organism. So in our case, the humans. And all of our genes are in the same order. So that sequence is the same in everybody. We all have the same genes and they're all written in the same order.
Okay.
So we are 99.9% completely identical.
Wow. I had no idea it was that much.
Completely identical. Yeah, I didn't either.
Yeah.
And so it's only 0.1% that makes us different, whether it's hair color, eye color, skin color, inclination towards cardiovascular disease or diabetes or a whole host of other health problems. All of that falls into that 0.1% uniqueness, because everything else is the same.
I guess it's a powerful 0.1%, obviously, because it can take you on so many different pathways. Yeah.
So each gene may have one or two letter differences. So those nucleotides, those rungs on the ladder, may be different by only one or two letters in order to make that gene different.
Okay.
And when that differentness happens, because the gene is an instruction to build a protein, the protein can change. And when the protein changes, you may change its function. You may make less of it. You may make more of it. So it changes in such a way that we have to think about what that means in terms of our health.
Right.
And that's where my role in nutrigenetics and nutrigenomics comes in. So we can look at diet and lifestyle and even supplement recommendations to support that uniqueness.
Right, right. And is this essentially what you're talking about is what epigenetics is all about?
Not
or is that
quite.
Different? Okay.
That's different. So what I'm talking about are variants, and I can explain epigenetics too.
Okay.
But what I'm talking about are variants. So sometimes people talk about mutations. So gene mutations. So mutation means it's a change. So that one letter, that two letters that are different in that gene is a mutation. But we try to get away from calling it a mutation because it has such a negative connotation.
Right.
So if you call it a variant, sometimes it's a good thing and sometimes it's not a good thing, but it's something that's different.
Gotcha.
So these gene variants are what we want to address. Epigenetics is a little bit different in the sense that it's an additional set of instructions.
Okay.
So your DNA sequence is going to be always the same, but your epigenetics is like a tag that goes on top of the DNA sequence to modify the gene. And it's entirely related to lifestyle, environment, exposure. And so identical twins are one of the ways that they compare epigenetics or describe epigenetics the most, because at birth, identical twins have identical DNA. But then if you put them in two locations, nutrition, lifestyle, exposure to smoke, all different things like that can actually impact on their DNA to change their health status, to change how tall they grow, to change their level of fitness. All of these things can be impacted, good or bad, based on their environment. So that's what epigenetics does. It's not changing your DNA, it's modifying the way it's expressed, what you see in that person.
Okay. So when you said it's kind of like a tag on there, I guess I don't understand. Does that doesn't actually change the DNA then?
It does not.
It adds on to it so that it expresses differently. Is that basically what you're saying? Okay.
That's correct.
Gotcha.
So you can either silence a gene or you can make it happen more to create the effect or to take away the effect that you're getting that you don't want to have.
Gotcha.
And therefore it's a fluid process. So you might be having an expression of poor health because of too many inflammatory foods in your diet, and then you remove those foods. You didn't change your DNA, but you changed the epigenome. And you pulled that out, you made a change, and then you modified the negative effect that you didn't want to see.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for breaking that down, because I had always kind of combined, gene expression, I guess, with the epigenetics, and because it's kind of talked about a lot these days in the functional health world, right? Talking about you can turn on or off your genes via epigenetics. So it's very helpful for me to understand the difference between the mutations and the epigenetics part. So thank you for sharing that.
Good.
Yeah.
I think probably the most important takeaway to summarize that topic is that, because I know you want to talk about more specific genes, but there are medical genes that, you have one gene and it equals generally a disease. But then there are, what I like to call lifestyle genes, which are things that can be influenced by your choices. So the foods that you eat, the lifestyle that you keep, the supplements that you take, and none of those genes in isolation are powerful enough to create a disease. They all have to work in pathways together to make something happen or make something not happen. So the kind of genetics that I focus on is not the disease-oriented genetics, but really more of the ones that you have the power to change and modify in your own life.
Gotcha. Totally makes sense. Thank you for that overview. Very helpful.
Sure.
So let's talk, because obviously this show is about hormones. And I'm so curious to understand this better. Let's talk about how these, gene mutations or variants will impact your hormones.
Sure. So hormones broadly are chemical messengers. They're basically things that are designed to tell your body what to do or how to behave. So estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, insulin, even dopamine. And so our genes and our diet and our lifestyle all have the ability to regulate and or break down these hormones. And when the hormones are not metabolized or broken down properly, it can lead to certain symptoms. It can lead to health problems. And so remember, genes are the instructions for building proteins, which include enzymes. And so genes are responsible for building the enzymes that are part of that breakdown process.
Okay.
So when we think about how genes and hormones interplay, it's whether those enzymes are functioning properly to either turn off or break down the hormones.
Gotcha. Okay. So, specifically what I was interested in was talking about the COMT gene because of its role with estrogen metabolism. And so what you're saying essentially is the enzyme being made when there's a COMT variant is not necessarily enough of the enzyme or has changed the enzyme. Is that?
Yeah, no, that's great. So that's a great starting point. So COMT stands for, so the COMT gene codes for or instructs for the COMT enzyme. So that stands for catechol, which is like a type of estrogen.
Okay.
Catechol O methyltransferase, which is a mouthful. So
yeah,
it's just COMT, C-O-M-T.
It's easier to say COMT. Yeah.
Yeah, it sure is. And so it's an important enzyme in the detoxification pathway, but only part 2. There's 2 parts to the detoxification pathway, but it's also part of another cellular pathway called methylation. So COMT has a major role on a cellular level in protecting our body. And it impacts brain health, it impacts hormones, it impacts caffeine metabolism. It's basically responsible for helping to get estrogen out of the body. So when you have a COMT variant, you can either have the variant that makes too much COMT, or you can have one that makes not enough. So it can go either way.
Gotcha.
So if we're talking about poor estrogen metabolism, that's going to be the COMT that reduces the function of the enzyme.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
So it might be easier to think about it if, I'm not sure if you want me to go a little bit about detoxification and explain that a little bit and how that works.
Absolutely. Yes, for sure.
So detoxification is, well, why do we need it, right? So we have toxins, we have things that are coming into our body that we don't want to be there anymore. So that's that's the purpose, right? You have something that's coming in or something that's already in your body that you don't want there anymore, and you want to get rid of it or break it down. Some people talk about doing a detox, like, hey, I'm going to drink lemon water or charcoal or drink this tea or fast or, whatever it is for 7 days or 30 days. And that's all good it supports liver function, and most of the detoxification occurs in the liver, but it's not going to compensate for a defect in the genes.
That makes sense.
And so, certainly it's like supportive care, but it's not going to be the primary focus. So
right.
Our bodies are made to detoxify. We can do it 365 days per year. We have the instructions, the genes for how to do that. It's generally a 2-part process. So part 1, or phase 1, is mostly done in the liver. So in the case of estrogen, you have estrone, estradiol coming in, and the set of enzymes that is supposed to change that estrogen, getting it ready to be excreted. There's a group of enzymes called cytochrome P450, and they're the primary enzymes that work in the liver. And what they do is they change the estrogen in such a way that it actually becomes more toxic than it was when it started. And so now you really need to step it up to get rid of the estrogen. And that's where part 2, or phase 2, happens. And this is where COMT comes into play. So COMT will change that catechol estrogen. That's where its name comes from.
Okay.
It will change that estrogen to something called methoxyestrogen, which is an inert, benign molecule or substance, metabolite, that can be excreted. So basically, COMT acts on the toxic metabolite of the catechol estrogen, changes it in such a way that it becomes inert and can't be acted on anymore. And then further down in the process, another enzyme acts on it so that it can be excreted.
Gotcha.
If your COMT is not working well enough, then you're not going to be able to change all of that estrogen into the inert methoxyestrogen.
Gotcha.
So what it does is it stays longer in that phase 2 detox process. And there are other enzymes that are going to act on it along the way. But before it gets to the point where there's a potential problem, there's another enzyme that can act on it to recycle it back to COMT and give it another go.
Okay.
And so
So this is still in the liver. It's still being.
No, some of it's in the liver. Yeah. But,
okay.
But basically the point is that there are so many enzymes that are part of this process.
Gotcha.
So when we focus on one, like COMT, and say, oh, I have a variant in COMT, is my whole detox process shot and nothing's going to work? Well, no.
Right.
Because you have other enzymes that are going to kind of help out.
Gotcha.
And so the problem really becomes when the whole pathway falls apart, and you have all these toxic metabolites, whether it's estrogen or food additives or smoke or pesticides, anything that you're trying to get through that process. When you're not breaking it down properly and it gets all the way to the end, it can attach itself to DNA and it damages the DNA. And then that DNA, because every time a cell divides and replicates, it gets a full copy. And so all the next generations of that cell will get copied the damaged DNA. Gotcha. So that's the reason why you want to support that process.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And so I know, there's the phase 1 and phase 2 in the liver, which you just talked about. And then phase 3, sometimes called phase 3 in the colon, essentially, or in the intestines. And I know that's another aspect, right? It can become deconjugated, I believe is the term. If estrogen has already been packaged up and made water soluble, but it can be sort of re-released. Is that what's happening?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest takeaway for me with GI health is that if your GI health is poor, because if it's estrogen, it's not, well, it might be coming in through supplement form, but regardless of what it is, if you're ingesting a toxin and your gut health is poor, or you have leaky gut, these things are not even getting a pass at going through the detoxification pathway. They're just kind of getting through that permeable membrane and into the blood supply
straight up.
Up.
Okay.
And so when I think about detoxification and gut health, I think that connection is important.
That makes sense. Yeah. Especially when you think of, xenoestrogens that are coming in via our, food and plastics and all those kinds of things. So,
Cosmetics.
yeah, all that good stuff. So one other question I wanted to ask you too about phase 2 in terms of you have your COMT, as you were saying, and then obviously other enzymes, and then methylation. Is that not happening in part of phase 2? Is that like a separate thing that's happening in the body?
That's a separate process.
Okay. Okay. I always
Yeah.
thought that was together. So
No,
that, okay.
it's complementary. So
Okay.
you want methylation and detoxification are cellular defense processes. So methylation um, is basically a process that's supposed to create new DNA and repair damaged DNA.
Okay.
So if you have, the damaged DNA at the end of your poorly functioning detox pathway, that's where methylation can step in
Okay.
and be helpful. But it is a different pathway.
Okay.
Do you want me to?
Yeah, I'm
explain
just
it to you,
curious
or?
because I'd love to hear it because, in my mind, it was always part of, the liver in terms of thinking about the sulfation, the methylation, all those kinds of things. So yeah, I would love for you to break it down a little bit further.
Okay, so methylation is, as I said, responsible for DNA repair, for making new DNA. It also can affect how we respond to stress, how we handle inflammation. And it's a process of turning on or turning off genes. And so by optimizing methylation, you can decrease your risk of chronic disease. So the two things really do work together. I think the easiest way to explain it is if you were to think about a relay race. So if you were to imagine 3 laps around a track, and the way the methylation process works, and the big gene that people talk about when they hear about methylation is MTHFR.
Yeah.
So if we can talk about that too a little bit if you want to, but the methylation process is like a relay going around a track 3 times.
Okay.
So at the beginning, in your first lap, you have folate, which is what starts the process.
Okay.
And folate kind of enters the track, takes the baton, and kind of heads off running. And in that first cycle, which is the folate lap, MTHFR is the gene that will act on folate to metabolize it.
Okay.
And it's working it around the track, getting it ready to pass off to the next cycle, which is the methionine cycle, to make methionine. And the third lap, the baton gets passed, and the third lap is the transsulfuration pathway, with the end result being glutathione. Okay. So methylation starts with folate and ends with glutathione. Okay. So that's essentially what you're trying to create.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's a very complicated pathway.
So that when you say pathway, that doesn't necessarily mean it is a pathway in the liver. It can be a pathway elsewhere. Okay.
No. Right,
okay.
Right.
Gotcha. Okay.
So the key takeaway, so MTHFR is one gene that functions within that pathway. Gotcha. A lot of people talk about that gene and they say, oh, I have it, like it's a disease. Yeah. But we all have it because we know that we all have the same genes. It's all part of the same sequence. So we all have it. So again, we go back to, do you have the variant of MTHFR? Right. And if you do, then your MTHFR enzyme is going to be less functional.
It happens. My cat goes off screaming a lot of the time. It's all good.
Okay, I think she's calm. So the MTHFR gene is, let's see, I lost my train of thought thanks to the dog, is going to, the relevant part is whether or not there's a variant to the MTHFR. Right. And if it is, there's other ways that you can get to the next lap.
Okay.
It doesn't always have to go through that. Now, it's not as efficient, but there are other ways of getting around it.
And that's why one of the reasons that they'll take methylfolate in that situation is that
Yeah. So yes. So the thing is, if you have an MTHFR deficiency,
Mhm.
then you are not able to metabolize folate.
Folate,
So
right.
if you were to supplement with folic acid,
Mhm.
you don't have the genetics to properly
Properly.
change folic acid to the active form.
Gotcha.
So yes, you can take methylated folate or active form folate,
Mhm.
but in regular doses. Like
Mm.
you don't need super
Super
high
high
doses.
ones.
You just need, like 400 micrograms of
Gotcha.
folate.
Okay. So people
Um,
really overdo it with getting into
yeah,
thousands. Yeah.
no, you don't.
Yeah.
You don't
Yeah.
need that much.
Yeah.
And the other thing that you want to think about is just supporting the diet with B
Mhm.
vitamins.
Mhm.
So sometimes people will take methylated B vitamins. You can just take regular B vitamins. Choline
Mhm.
is a reasonable dietary adjunct as well. Especially that's highest in egg yolk. Is a
Mhm.
great way to get choline into the diet.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. And then a lot of times people are seeming to look for that end result of glutathione, right? Because that's the master antioxidant and that's really important, right? In phase 2 of liver detox. A lot of
Yes.
glutathione is used there.
Yes.
Yeah. So what do you think about people jumping to, if they have an MTHFR variant, jumping to glutathione? Is that not necessarily a good way to go about it?
Let me think about that. So I think that if you have, you're still not going to have folate. So
Right.
I think that
You're missing the folate and the
yeah,
methionine.
I think that one of the problems that we run into when we look at a gene by itself
Mhm.
is that we're trying to change or fix an outcome based on one step in the process.
Right.
And so it might be helpful to
Mhm.
supplement, but it also might be helpful to just say, hey, everything else is working fine. I just have this one gene variant. Maybe I
Right.
just want to support that. So
Right.
you really want to support yourself in the way that it's uniquely appropriate to you,
Yeah.
and not just follow um, blanket recommendations that you have to take all these supplements because of one
Right.
alteration in the gene.
That makes sense. That makes perfect sense because I mean, it's looking at it from a holistic perspective, right? Not just going in and doing that one thing and trying to change it. So let's go back to estrogen metabolism because that's such a issue in my practice, at least, right? I have a lot of women coming to me with fibroids, ovarian cysts, things like that. Um, so if we're not just looking at the comp gene, in terms of that, obviously we're looking at phase 1, 2. Phase 1's not always working optimally when fibroids and ovarian cysts in particular are at play. But what else are we looking at genetically?
So if we're looking at hormonal health,
Hmm.
you're going to look at uh, quinone reductase.
Okay.
You're going to look at manganese superoxide.
Okay.
Um, you'll look at, I mean, dopamine is always relevant. The
I definitely
dopamine
want to talk about dopamine
receptors.
here in a little while too.
Um, so those are the ones that come to mind.
Okay. So in that case, when you're if you could explain a little bit because I don't understand this aspect of like I've seen, a comped variant or whatever and it'll say like plus plus and then another one will say like plus minus. Is this something?
So I'm not familiar with the pluses
Okay.
because I work with the letters or the amino
Gotcha.
acids, but
Okay.
um, so I guess I don't know how to answer
Okay,
that.
that's yeah, that's okay. Because I've seen it in some places, and then other times I don't. So I didn't really understand, what that meant and why that was necessary. But it makes sense if you're just working with the letters directly. So if you are, having, say, that comped variant that is making sort of less of that enzyme, you know, what are some of the things that you start to do maybe with all of those, if you would, have a picture of the ones that you just mentioned, the genes that you just mentioned that impact estrogen metabolism? What are some of the things that you might do in that situation?
Sure. So if excuse me, if we look at the COMT gene,
Mm-hmm.
the the wild type, or kind of what you would normally expect, is going to be COMT GA.
Okay.
If you have COMT AA,
Mm-hmm.
then you have 3 to 4 times less function in that
Okay.
enzyme.
Okay.
So the reason for there's an increased association with cancers that go along with the decreased COMT, so breast cancers and ovarian cancers,
Mm-hmm.
and that's going to be related to those toxic estrogen metabolites, that intermediary stage, because you don't have enough COMT to kind of manage that.
Mm-hmm.
There might also be higher levels of dopamine because you're not breaking down the dopamine same way, because
Mm-hmm.
it's going through that same pathway, which can lead to changes in cognitive function, lower pain thresholds. Heavy coffee drinkers, caffeinated beverages, probably aren't getting a good detox effect, and so might get more stimulant exposure that way.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's combined with MTHFR, then there's a greater chance of having depressive episodes. But again, this is one gene,
Right.
and this list of things sounds awful if you're
Right.
looking at that all by itself.
Right.
And
Right.
so I'm really reluctant to say, because, and every combination of these hormones is going to be different in
Mm-hmm.
everybody. And so we
Mm-hmm.
have to look at, what traits, what things are being present in you right
Mm-hmm.
now.
Mm-hmm.
And then how does that relate to all the different genes and gene variants that you have that kind of
Mm-hmm.
fit into those pathways.
Gotcha.
So I'm a little reluctant to run off a list of all the different things that
Right.
all the
Right.
genes do, because I think it actually can be really overwhelming.
Right.
And even a little scary if you don't have all the information, or you're not, managing it with the process of kind of taking a history from someone, understanding what their goals are, what their health issues are, and then looking at what their genetic blueprint looks like and making recommendations based on that.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to
It
me.
makes me think that people might get nervous and think like all these bad things are going to happen if they have this one gene variant, and that's definitely not what I'm saying.
Right, right, right. And it's a good reminder of how powerful our bodies are and how they've set up lots of different things to help us along the way, right? It's not
Right.
just this one thing that's going to help. Um what was I going to say? So do you, when you do genetic testing, do you also run, like, say, like a serum lab or anything like that at the same time to sort of see how it's expressing itself,
So
currently?
it's usually after the fact.
Okay.
So once we know what the genetic panel
Mhm.
is,
Mhm.
then sometimes there are certain functional tests and things that can
Mhm.
be recommended based on the genetic blueprint and the way that it's manifesting in that person.
Yeah.
But to just run everything in advance, you'd be doing tons of blood and urine studies, and it's
Right.
like taking a shot in the dark. So it's
Right.
it's better if you do it once you have the information.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, so let's talk more about dopamine, because I do
Okay.
find that fascinating. And essentially this, I think I mentioned to you, I've seen this on tests quite a few times, on Dutch tests, on oat tests, on my own, seeing sort of that lowered dopamine, and really wondering about that. Like, what is that all about? And so, what is happening with the comp gene and dopamine?
So it's actually really similar to estrogen. And
Okay.
so I actually don't use oat testing or
Mm.
Dutch in my current practice.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't speak to those tests specifically.
Mm-hmm.
But it's all part of that same process, so that if the COMT is decreased, then it's not going to degrade or break down the dopamine in the same way, and you can have excess
higher levels of dopamine then. Okay.
Versus if you have a very aggressive, high enzyme activity COMT gene, then you may burn through your dopamine faster because it's really going fast through that pathway. But dopamine is a neurotransmitter, so it's like a brain chemical regulator.
Right.
It looks at emotion. It looks at the reward center. It impacts our sleep, and the way that dopamine is supposed to work is that you want kind of a happy balance in the middle. So too little and too much are both not
good.
Where you want to be. But there are several genes that code for or instruct for the dopamine receptors. So whether or not you have COMT, still, again, that's one gene, and you would have to look at how the dopamine receptor genes are also sequenced in you, because that's going to be a factor as well, right? If your dopamine receptors are working perfectly and your COMT is reduced, then you just need to support COMT. But if you have a problem with both, then you need to, support both aspects.
Yeah. So when you do the testing with people and you sort of see, what the blueprint of them is, how long after making changes does it usually take, in order for them to feel differently?
So that's a hard question to answer. Because, the thing is, I think with the cellular processes, you don't always see something right away. It's more something that you kind of know you're making like a life change, that you're going to, create more benefits, and it's small incremental things that change over time, right? You're not going to see if your cells or your DNA was changing, or if your cells did a good job repairing your DNA by making those changes.
Right.
But if you were to change your diet, for example, to decrease your caffeine intake, and you noticed that maybe you were sleeping better and you didn't feel so agitated or jittery, I mean, those changes can happen as long as it takes for those things to be metabolized. So I think it's really dependent on what you're addressing.
Right. And do you have people, you've done the genetic testing, you've created the plan based off of that, you maybe do some further testing to see how it's, I guess, manifesting in the body currently. Will you, 6 months down the road or a year down the road, retest, say, a serum lab or another functional lab to sort of see if that's showing up after making changes?
So you can. So you would never retest the genetics,
right? Because that's for
you
good,
don't need to.
Right?
Yeah. So you don't need to. So that's a good thing. You never, you're one and done.
Right.
As far as the functional tests, well, sure, functional tests can change over time. I generally would. I think there are certain things that you really want to see if there was a positive change, and so you may retest that. But if the client is feeling better based on the recommendations that you made, it really depends on them. Like, you don't have to always repeat everything.
Right.
Sometimes you do, because you just want that data to see what it shows.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's positive reinforcement that the recommendations were actually useful. And sometimes just feeling better or feeling stronger or sleeping better is enough reinforcement, and they don't necessarily need the extra test.
Yeah, that makes sense. So can you explain a little bit more about how you work with people one-on-one?
Sure. So right now, I do one-on-one counseling where I do nutritional intake. I prefer to use the genetics test within my practice, because I think that it really helps to personalize the types of recommendations that I offer. So there's nothing cookie cutter about my diet or lifestyle recommendations. They're really unique to that person. And then I do, 3 to 6 month plans for nutritional counseling and lifestyle management, if that's what people need. And sometimes I just do, a one-time visit if they just want like a really in-depth understanding of their genetics and some basic recommendations.
Oh, that sounds awesome. So how do people get in touch with you?
So I can be contacted through my website, which is www.nutritionnp.com,
Perfect.
nutritionnp.com, or through Facebook. And my Facebook page is Nutrition NP.
Okay, great. And we'll have that in the notes so that people can click directly from there and find you. Thank you so much for being here today and sharing all
My
this
pleasure.
fascinating information with us, because it is just every time. I mean, I'm so, looking forward to learning more, doing programs sometime in, later this year. But like every time I start to dig into the genetic stuff, I'm like, there's just, so many layers to it. And I think that you did a great job of breaking down those basics so that people can understand, what's happening in the body. So I appreciate that a lot.
Thank you. This was
Yeah.
great. Really appreciated it.
All right, you guys, I will see you next time.